Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this Climate Week panel on a 640 million acre question. What's happening to America's vast public lands? The answer has huge implications, and not only for those who love visiting national parks. Tribal nations live alongside or rely on public lands seized from them in earlier centuries. Businesses make a living off these lands. And because broad swaths have oil, gas, and coal, decisions about what to extract and what to leave in the ground have global consequences. I'm Jamie Smith Hopkins, managing editor at Inside Climate News. I'm joined today by three ICN journalists who know a ton about what has become a tumultuous era for public lands. Wyatt Myskow covers the Southwest for ICN. He's based in Arizona and has put more miles than he can count on his car in the past few years, traveling across the region for stories, often about or near public lands. Jake Bolster reports on Wyoming and the West for ICN. Public lands constitute nearly half of Wyoming, long the top coal-producing state in the nation. And Michael Kodas edits both Wyatt and Jake as part of his work as a senior editor at ICN. He's based in Colorado and has deep expertise about both public lands and wildfires, subjects that frequently intersect. So give me the big picture. What's happening with public lands right now, and why does that matter? Wyatt?
Well, thanks for having us, Jamie. And I think this is a really important topic to be discussing for all Americans really right now. There's really no shortage of things happening to our public lands, but I think we can kind of put them in four kind of broad buckets. The first being under the Trump administration, funding for public land related projects like conservation efforts, rewilding after wildfires, things like that have been severely cut. I've reported, across Arizona and the West of various projects, grants to nonprofits and NGOs doing conservation work that have been cut. That has big implications, of course, for public lands and how they're managed and the status of the wildlife and the habitats there. The second is that thousands of employees have been cut across public land federal agencies. The Interior Department, for example, which manages or which oversees the Bureau of Land Management as well as the National Park Service, has seen an 11% cuts so far this year, and that number is a little bit old. It might be a bit higher at this point. Um, the third, and this was perhaps the most controversial so far this year, was proposed sell-offs in Congress supported by the Trump administration of public lands. This was touted as a way to boost housing and address the housing crisis in our nation. But of course, when you looked at the lands being proposed to be sold off, many of them were not in places necessarily that make a lot of sense for housing, and also many have risk of these are drought-prone areas, places that are being, going through acidification due to climate change. Also, in places vulnerable to wildfires, many kind of questions over that. And as part of that, too, the Trump administration has proposed dismantling of various national monuments across the West. Big part of that is for extractive purposes. Some of these national monuments, unsurprisingly, contain huge swaths of coal, copper, other minerals, uranium, that the Trump administration and various industries would like to see. I mean, one example that I've covered here in Arizona is Ironwood National Forest. Right outside of Ironwood is one of the state's copper producing mines. They would like to expand their mine, but they can't because it's protected by a national monument. If that national monument was downsized or dismantled, maybe they could expand. And finally, and this is maybe one of the really important ones to me, is the gutting of rules, and the issuing of executive orders to boost extraction on public lands. We're seeing the attempted repeal of the roadless rule, which protects roadless areas in our national forests. We're seeing the proposed rescission of the public lands rule, which put conservation on an equal footing as extractive industries on our nation's public lands. And we've seen various executive orders from President Trump to boost and streamline developments on public lands. I cover a lot of mining here in Arizona and across the Southwest. There's a gold mine right now in Nevada that I'm working on a story about that will essentially have far less public comment and less environmental review than it usually would under previous administrations because of current executive orders and because of the Trump administration's actions. And all those things are to get tied together, and all of these things kind of go hand in hand. But those are kind of just the big picture things happening right now.
Thanks, Wyatt. Yeah, it's been a lot happening this year. Jake, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, great to be here, and I think Wyatt covered really everything that's happening. And what I would add is, the reaction to these moves has really underlined a lot of the bipartisan support that public lands have in the United States, and that's really no small feat right now, given our political climate that's so fractured and polarized. Um, the proposal to sell off public lands that Wyatt brought up was defeated in large part because people, mainly in the western half of the United States, expressed frustration and objected to that plan. I think at one point in the Senate, when they were discussing this, they had exempted all public lands in Montana from being included in a public land sell-off because that state is so notoriously um, behind public land and has such support for public land. So these are issues that at a time where a lot of Americans, I think, would tell you that they don't really feel connected to their legislators. Well, here was an issue that people spoke up about, and at least for now, politicians in DC have retreated a little bit from this fervor to sell off public lands for one reason or another. Um, Another thing I've been struck by in the public lands realm since this administration took over is actually just how much of the spotlight they've taken up. And I think this is because public lands were some of the proving grounds for the previous administration's uh, legislative wins. There was clean energy development on public lands. There was the public land rule that the Biden administration passed. Well, now the public land rule, the Trump administration just announced that they're looking to undo this rule, which elevated conservation to equal footing as mining, grazing, and other forms of extraction on public land. So, this administration has been really focused on these 640 million acres, and it has become a really national issue in a way that under the first Trump administration, it might have been a little more niche.
Thanks, Jake. Michael, would you like to add anything?
No, but I think, one thing to point out is even though the majority of our public lands are in the West, and it is seen as a Western issue, we have national forests in particular that are across the country. And, it is not just a bipartisan issue in the West, but is actually something that many people in the Eastern United States are equally concerned about.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. You're right, because so much of the discussion has been focused on the West. That can be easily forgotten. How does all of this affect tribal nations? What are some of the most pressing issues for them?
Well, yeah, when we talk about public lands, I think tribes are often brought up in these discussions because they're adjacent to public lands. And obviously, a lot of our public lands were stolen from them. Many of them are ancestral lands in many cases. I would say, I mean, for the tribes that I've spoken to, and it's important to keep in mind, tribes aren't a monolith. Each tribe is different. Each tribe is unique and has their own positions on these things and has to deal with various things regarding public lands. The first I would say is they have also generally on all climate and environmental matters, we've seen big cuts to address those types of issues. No, and that's the same is true for the tribes. They and cuts to clean air, cuts to things to restore homes, public land management. Generally, this affects the tribes too. And that's been something I've been chronicling here, like on the Navajo Nation and the Hopi reservations here in Arizona. Another big one, though, more, I guess, important on public lands is there was executive orders under the Biden administration that have now been rescinded to work with tribes more, to co-steward lands with them, to incorporate them earlier in process. One example, there was a proposed lithium project here in Arizona that became a federal court case. The tribe won, and essentially that they were doing test drilling to test for lithium near a sacred site for the tribe. This is the Wildfire tribe here in Arizona, and that led to this sacred spring running dry and fissures in the earth cracking open. And this is something that the tribe had warned for years in public comments to the Bureau of Land Management. But the BLM, went ahead and approved this project, and this happened, and the courts ruled that the tribe was not officially, was not correctly consulted, and the impacts of this were not properly evaluated. The Biden administration then had a rule that was never, as far as I'm aware, was able to actually be implemented in any cases, but it was designed to avoid problems like that. From the get-go, when you propose drilling on public lands for a mine, even in these very early phases when these mining companies don't even know if they actually are going to mine, to incorporate the tribes and work with them to avoid situations like this. That rule was rescinded, as well as executive orders that kind of, extended upon that. So those are things, some of the tangible things. When I talk to some of the tribes too, I mean, their feelings on this is that it's the same old story over and over again, right? When we're talking about selling off public lands or dismantling of national monuments like Bears Ears, for example, in southern Utah, that was, that the tribes fought for that for decades. And now, under the Trump administration, it was rolled back. The first time around, they're thinking about doing it again. For the tribes, I mean, it's just kind of the same old story. The lands that they care about are not lands that the federal government often cares about. And with, the streamlining of projects and fast tracking, of course, they're worried about having their voices left out. But in many cases, their voices have been left out under the Biden administration, under the Obama administration, under the first Trump administration for, decades and decades and decades, really, as long as, the U.S. has existed, this has happened. So in many ways, I mean, it's kind of the same old story for the tribes, which, the same old story is not a good one for them. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Wyatt. Jake, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'm seeing and hearing pretty similar sentiments. So in Wyoming, the Wind River Reservation is home to two tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho. And when something like a public land sell-off or tries to get, run through the House and the Senate under this administration, and there's a line in there saying that cities and local municipalities and states have the first grab at this land. Well, there are, tribal nations within our borders who this land was taken from, as Wyatt pointed out, hundreds of years ago. And nowhere in this public land sell-off push was there any mention of giving tribes an opportunity to perhaps reacquire some land that would be important to them for culturally, spiritually, and not that these parcels were bordering reservations or that kind of land, but this sentiment that Wyatt brought up, that the federal government is acting without much regard for tribal concerns, is a tale as old as time, and one that continues under this administration. I do believe there was some language in there about consulting with tribes, but oftentimes that type of language, that type of consultation, I think to tribes feels more like a checking of the box than an actual nation to nation, government to government, sit down and let's try to find something that we can both agree on type of initiative. And case in point is on Wind River. This reservation has a history that goes back hundreds of years. It was 44 million acres to start. It has been whittled down to a little over 2 million acres at its present size. And there is land here that the tribes feel like ought to be theirs and isn't theirs. And last year there was a push by Wyoming to convey some infrastructure and some land from federal hands to a private irrigation district. And this is a parallel to a public land sell-off in some ways, where you have the federal government facilitating some sort of land transaction. And even when it's within the borders of a reservation, the tribes are left out of the conversation. So this is, I would say, like Wyatt said, probably unsurprising for tribal folks at this moment.
Thanks, Jake. Well, worsening climate change has consequences for us all, as you all three know very well, from dangerous weather extremes to rising food prices. And the Biden administration took steps to make public lands less of a contributor to climate change. Is that right? How is that shifting under the Trump administration? Wyatt?
Yeah, I'd start with by saying under the Biden administration, climate change was obviously one of their big focus points of focusing on it and addressing, something that the Trump administration is certainly less interested in doing it at all. One thing I'd add to on the public land front on that, though, is that the Biden administration really considered public lands as one of the answers to addressing climate change. I think when we talk about climate change, there's obviously, and understandably so, kind of a lot of blame gets put on, the fossil fuel industry, the pollution that, that is caused and is causing. But kind of also very important, of course, is land degradation and the loss of, wild spaces that could, store carbon, sequester it, right? And also, I mean, it is just kind of in really hugely importance of biodiversity. And public lands and the western half of the United States is one of those kind of rare places left in the world where certainly a lot has been developed and a lot of lands have been degraded from ranching, mining, from the fossil fuel industry, but a lot of lands are still very much intact and still have a lot of these values of protecting biodiversity, sequestering carbon, all these various things. And so the Biden administration made a focal point of, like the public lands rule that we mentioned earlier, of which really was just kind of reinforcing what legislation from the 70s says how we should manage our public lands. Of course, actually doing that was a different story, and that's why the public lands rule was needed. But it was, it was about protecting and putting conservation on an equal footing and ensuring that these, some of the last wild spaces that we have in this country are still protected and can still do the things we want them to do when we talk about trying to address climate change and protect biodiversity and all these various things. And yeah, I'll let Jake handle the rest of it.
Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, so one of the biggest and probably most climate consequential pivots from the Biden administration to the Trump administration when it comes to public lands has been the Trump administration's approach to the Powder River Basin. This is a coal formation that spans much of northeast Wyoming and southeast Montana. And this is where most of the nation's coal comes from. Under the Biden administration, there were plans laid out by the Bureau of Land Management that would prevent new coal mines from coming online in this region of the country. The rationale being the mines that were already there could still mine for another decade or more, most likely, and that the resource mix on the grid in the future, given climate change, ought not to include coal. We should stop coal mining in this region. This is a region that's famously dependent on coal mines for local economies. And so the local reaction from those states was generally not positive. And now the Trump administration has done a total 180. They are reopening mining in the area for new mines. They are fast tracking coal mines in the area, and they are slashing regulation and fees that coal companies have to pay to mine on these public lands. And this has been part of the Trump administration's push for more drilling, more oil, more gas, and more coal. And we know the science tells us that this burning these resources is making the climate crisis worse. And so when it comes to public lands, they are a haven for recreation and for outdoorsing, but they are also an important part of a lot of energy companies' balance sheets. And this pivot in the Powder River Basin, could be really consequential for the US's emissions going forward. Is it going to single-handedly tip the scale one way or the other? I can't say. But the posture of the federal government being, a total 180 is going to have impacts to not just local coal mining, but the environment there. I mean, mining and extracting resources out of the earth has a long history of polluting the surrounding environment. And I've spoken with local environmental groups and ranchers who are happy to see the coal mining industry paused because they were concerned about the environmental toll. So this is not a story that's going away, and definitely one to watch for as other management plans under the former administration that were a little less resource friendly are now in the process of getting walked back.
Thanks, Jake. Michael, what else do you think would be important to point out about climate change and public lands?
Well, one aspect of public lands are our national forests are all public lands and are quite vast, and they're kind of getting hit by the administration in regards to climate from two sides. And on one side, the administration is in the midst of completely reworking how the nation deals with wildfires, and how the nation is going to respond to wildfires. In many cases, longtime firefighters have kind of hoped to see reforms along the lines of what the administration has proposed. But in other cases, they worry that, well, they've lost a lot of personnel, they've lost a lot of expertise in dealing with wildfires, and they've also lost the recognition by leaders in Washington that fire is a natural process in our forests that actually helps to ensure our forests' health. And if the administration, as it seems like it is leaning to do, pushes for a full suppression of all natural wildfires, where we just are throwing all of our resources at putting fires out, then we will continue to interrupt the natural fire cycle in our forests. That has led to a lot of the really bad fires that we've seen later on after that's gone on, and has also led to fires that much more severely affect the forest's ability to sequester carbon than our natural fire cycle did in the past. So the changes to wildland fire under this administration could be incredibly significant, both from a climate standpoint and also from a safety standpoint for the people who fight these fires and for the communities that have developed next to them. On the other side of this is the administration's push to really increase our harvesting of timber from our forests. And, that's, one of the oldest resources that we have drawn from our forests. And those two pushes are interconnected. Pretty much every time you see a bad, very dramatic fire or a very bad fire season, you have a big push that we could log our way out of this problem. If we just went and harvested more of these trees and pulled them out of there, then they wouldn't be there to burn and they wouldn't drive big forest fires. But the reality is that the trees that are valuable to the timber industry, the very big trees of highly valuable timber, are the very trees that have evolved to be resilient to fire and make a forest less likely to burn. And they also sequester the most carbon. So they do the biggest work that we can hope in a forest for our climate. And what we really need removed from our forests are the scrappy little trees that didn't get a chance to grow because they're under the big granddaddy trees, or scrub or grasses or other vegetation that really has no economic value. So there's not really a likelihood that increasing timber harvesting is going to help us get out of our fire problem. And what we stand to have happen is, from one side, fires really interrupting a forest's ability to sequester carbon, and at the same time, an industry going into those forests to remove the trees that actually are sequestering carbon. So forests could be having their ability to sequester carbon kind of undergo a double whammy in that sense. And finally, the same is really true of the grazing industry. Grazing can reduce fire hazard when it's really well managed and at just the right level. But there's a long history of intensive grazing actually making fire worse in forests, as when overgrazing removes grasses that held back those scrubby trees that can drive bad fires, and those start to fill in those spaces. But we still see, after bad fire seasons, the livestock industry say, if you just let our cattle in there to graze, that would lower our fire hazard, which historically is not proven to be the case. So we're seeing big pushes on development in our forests, logging, grazing, also, pushes to mine more, to have more oil and gas exploration and drilling. And all of those are tied to an increase in wildfire in our forests that could actually be pretty significant, particularly considering how bad our fire seasons have been getting in the last decade.
Thank you, Michael. Well, there have long been fights over how public land should be used and whether some of it should be public at all. So I was hoping you could explain the history people should know and how is that influencing what's happening today? Like what arguments are people making in favor of extracting more from these lands or selling them off entirely? Wyatt?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think history is incredibly important in this current moment. I would say, I mean, really, the history of the western half of the U.S. is tied to two things. Just one being water and how to get it, and the other is public lands and kind of the role it plays in the West. I think it's important to note that in the 60s and 70s, when we first when we realized maybe we should protect the environment a little bit, when rivers were strange colors and miners could do whatever they wanted. Those acts to protect wild places and also to protect the environment generally, both for ecological purposes, but also for human purposes, passed. I mean, overwhelmingly, bipartisanly, right? Like the Wilderness Act passed 373 to 1 when it was passed, I believe, in 1963 or 1964. Something that's the Wilderness Act today is very controversial. I don't think you'd find many Republicans who like, or people in the Trump administration who like the Wilderness Act. But once upon a time, these things were really popular. Beginning kind of in the late 70s, though, and with the Reagan administration in the 80s, obviously there was kind of a shifting tone when I think you pass these things. I think people realize, well, this is not very good for industry. Obviously, these protections, and obviously there was major pushback. And I'd say you have to start with like the Sagebrush Rebellion, which started in the late 70s. Essentially, the argument being across Western states that are dominated by sagebrush, that's the name, said that the federal government had usurped their land, even though obviously the federal government was there before the states, and that the land should be returned to them so that they could sell off the land, they could tax the land, they can do what they want with the land. And Ronald Reagan famously said, count me in as a rebel. It was a major talking point of his interior secretary at the time, who as James Watt, who said we will mine more, drill more, cut more timber. Those are words that sound like the exact same as we're hearing today. He quintupled coal mining leases in the country, as well as a variety of other things. So all I have to say is that I guess history currently is, or what's happening currently is very similar to what happened in the 80s, following kind of a backlash to environmental policy of the 60s and 70s. One thing I'd say about all that is that what we're seeing today, obviously very similar, and it's coming up in the same ways as we saw before, right? As Michael talked about, we're seeing attempts to log more, to mine more, to drill oil and gas more. And those have pretty huge consequences for the environment, obviously, and for climate change. And what we're seeing today is that the arguments remain the same as they did then. The states today, like Utah last year, went to the Supreme Court asking for pretty much every acre of public land that was not designated as a national park or a monument or had some kind of important designation to be turned over to the state. It's the same arguments we're seeing in Congress when we're proposing land sales. It's the same arguments you see from certain folks who don't like some of the national monuments that have been created, like Bears Ears or Bajnawa here in Arizona, to rescind them or to roll them back, saying the federal government is overreaching. So it's really many of the talking points are the exact same as they were in the 80s. And it continues to influence what is happening to this day in our nation's public lands. And I'd love to hear what Michael has to say, because he's been around for a lot longer than I am on this stuff. So
Thank you. Yes, please, Michael, what would you add?
Well, I think one thing that when we're really focused on the current moment, we might fail to realize is that we're actually looking at some long-term processes, obviously very long-term processes as far as how long it takes a forest to grow or for a mineral to develop underground that would be valuable to us. But even in our governing of these lands, we're looking at long-term processes, and even for people that promote disposing, as the term is, of our public lands, selling more of them off or opening them up for more resource extraction. The people that are dependent on that are looking for stability. And one example of how they are not getting that from this administration and sometimes from previous administrations is what's going on right now with the Congressional Review Act, overturning Bureau of Land Management resource management plans. And there are three of those from Alaska down towards where I live in Colorado that are being revisited by the administration, which is trying to interpret these plans, and they're just planning documents, as rules that would be subject for a period of time to Congress overturning them. And one aspect of the Congressional Review Act that is very concerning to both sides is that it prohibits a substantially similar rule from being passed in the future, which could mean that if you actually use the CRA to overturn one of these management plans, well, is any management plan going to be substantially similar? Does that mean we have no management plan? And how do I plan my business, be it a recreation-based business or a resource extraction business for the next 10 or 20 years if I can't plan, or if the plans that are put forward are constantly rescinded with political changes? It makes it very difficult for people to actually manage, businesses long term in the West. And, driving through the West, through Arizona, through Wyoming or Montana, you can visit so many towns that were once vibrant because maybe there was a coal mine there or a uranium mine or a sawmill there, and the whims of the economy or the whims of politics fell hard on that resource, and suddenly all the jobs went away, and eventually the town just basically blew away. And at least to me, that's always a symbol of how important having some good planning and stability is when we're thinking about how we're going to manage our public lands, not this year or for the next 4 years, but for the next 40 or 50 years.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, long-term thinking. That's a great point. Well, so I was hoping that we could close this really interesting discussion off with the public's role, because people might be listening to this and thinking, I'm part of the public. Do I have a say in what happens to public lands? So could you talk through a little bit what role the public does have in these decisions and how people can get involved if they want to? Jake?
Yeah, definitely. Well, as people may have surmised, they are public lands, and we are all members of the public. So yes, I guess the short answer is yes, you do have a role. Um, a lot of what we've been discussing today, revising management plans, walking back the public lands rule, all of these things are open for what's called a public comment. And when that happens, members of the public, it doesn't matter where you live, can typically write in and tell the administration how they feel about whatever it is they are proposing. They can express support or disagree, and it's recorded and published, and it's on the record. Um, someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think there is anything binding about those public comments. So the Trump administration does not have to go, geez, 95% of people don't like what we're doing, we have to stop. So it's not binding, but if telling, the administration how you feel, again, good or bad, is cathartic for you, that's an option. Another thing, though, that I think is really valuable is actually just spending time in these places. And that sounds a little silly and wishy-washy, but I find that to be really cathartic. Oftentimes when I'm in the West, and I know this is true for Michael and Wyatt too, I will use public lands on a reporting trip, whether it's to go on a hike to clear my head or park a car at night and sleep there and have an easy way to get to, a meeting the next day in these sometimes really rural places. Um, Public lands are a vital resource that are at a disposal for all Americans, and a place where each one of us can go for whatever it is that brings us there. And in my experience, being in the place and enjoying yourself, making memories, and not talking about politics, not talking about resource management plans, talking about your friends and your family. Um, Sports or art or anything else, that is really what these places ought to be about, and that's what they are about for many people. So availing them to yourself for that reason is something I would really recommend.
Thank you, Jake. And Wyatt, what would you add to that? You had mentioned, I think earlier, a lot of people reached out to their elected officials. So I assume that's another thing people can do.
Yeah, you can reach out to your elected officials as well as comment on, during public comment periods. I'll start by saying, Jake mentioned earlier the proposed land sell-offs in Congress. And I covered this when those were happening. A lot of it was based in Utah and Nevada. Nevada's 80% federal land. And it's the only state that really has an actual history of the feds selling off public land to the state and to developers for, good reason, because a lot of the state is federal land and they can't really do much about it. But when they proposed that land sell-off, one, even like senators and representatives who had proposed other lands bills to sell off in Nevada, for Nevada only, opposed that land sell-off because, one, it didn't do anything for conservation. Two, it didn't have the safeguards in place to actually get built what needed to be built. And third, a huge coalition from hunters and fishers to hikers to environmentalists to even industry folks and politicians who otherwise are happy to have this land bill to get the land they want sold, opposed this. And it was in part because so many members of the public and so many groups got involved to oppose it. It was, writing letters to senators and leaving calls with their offices and emails and all that kind of stuff to oppose it, right? And those bills failed in part because of the public backlash from around the nation, not just the states and communities that are going to be affected, but from everywhere. It's, public lands, even if you live somewhere where there's not a whole lot of public lands, or you live in the West where you live right next door to a national park and everywhere around you is public land. This is our nation's heritage. It's been said before, I'll say it again, it is one of the nation's best ideas. The idea that you can just roam out here, like where I live in Arizona, and I could go out and I can hike and I can roam around. And technically, every 14 days, I could set up a new camp, walk a mile down the road, and just keep living out there if I wanted to. It is truly something remarkable. That's something rare, and that's something that not many places have. And so even people who don't maybe use public lands as much or don't connect with them as much, it's still something that I think most Americans are quite proud to have and own, because you do own it. The federal government owns it on our behalf, not the other way around. To be somewhat of the bearer of bad news, though, like Jake said, if you write on any type of public comment or any type of project happening on public lands, even if 99% of people oppose it, doesn't mean they're going to stop the project. I hate to, if you want to stop a mine that's opening next door to you, good luck. Our mining laws don't let you really do that, no matter what happens. Even no matter how environmentally destructive it might be, how much water it might use, it can be really hard to stop projects. But you can issue public comments, and you can make as many, environmentalists and opposers of these projects will tell you, is that when you issue these public comments and you participate, you get a better project in the end. And even, companies will say that too. What they initially propose versus what actually gets built is better because of the public process. And a lot of companies aren't even opposed to the idea of public participation. But what we're seeing right now under the Trump administration, I think, is perhaps most concerning of all of this, is that the process to involve the public is being gutted, is being shortened, is being cut out. At the beginning of the year, there's a proposed lithium project in a place called near McDermott, Nevada. It's on the Oregon side, though. It's right on the border. It's a beautiful area. I was out there in May, and they proposed initially a 5-day public comment period for what would be, essentially the beginning of a massive one-day industrial open pit mine. 5 days is not nearly enough time. The public outlash, though, caused them to push it to 31 days, which is still typically less than most public comment periods. But that's really concerning. We're starting to see that more and more because of new executive orders from some court decisions this year, like 7 counties, which was a Supreme Court decision that's, basically was NEPA reform and permitting reform for our country. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there's now mines where essentially they're going to skip, typically the way a project will work is you have a public scoping process and then a draft EIS and then a final EIS. And then after all of that, which all includes public comment periods, then the BLM or whatever federal agency is permitting this will approve the project. And they will take in consideration those public comments. And they may not, stop a project if everyone opposes it, but they will implement certain things and address some of the concerns and find solutions for them. What one of these mines will be now doing is that draft environmental impact statement is now gone. there will be no public comment on that. And then when the final EIS comes out, there will again be no public comment period, and they will issue the record of decision approving the project or whatever the decision might be, but most likely approving the project on the same day. So effectively gutting 2/3, 2 of your 3 opportunities to issue public comments are now gone. I think that's really concerning because it means the public can't participate. And if you live next to a proposed mine coming in or new oil and gas drilling or whatever it might be, you're going to have a lot less say on that matter now. And your concerns may not be as well as addressed, if addressed at all. And so, yes, the public is involved and they should get involved. And I think that's why what we've seen so far, when people get involved from these broad coalitions and they really make their voices heard, the administration and the agencies have walked back some of these fast tracking decisions like they did, or these decisions to try and sell off public lands because the outcry has been so loud. And really, that's, I think, unfortunately, maybe the only way we might have to prevent some of these things or to stop, to be able to have even your voice heard is to really make it so loud that they can't ignore you and they have to give you what you're supposed to have, which is, the option to participate.
Thank you, Wyatt. And Michael, any final words to cap off this discussion?
Well, one industry that we've hinted at but not really talked about that's increasingly important is the outdoor recreation industry. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. We're talking hikers and cyclists and rafters, but also hunters and fishermen. In much of the country, our conservation efforts on public lands are paid for with taxes on hooks and bullets. And so we are participating in a lot of different ways. In the last 10 to 12 years across the country, states have created outdoor recreation industry offices, recognizing what a valuable revenue stream outdoor recreation is for them. And those offices at the state level actually do have, influence on policy that deals with public lands. By the same token, all of these businesses that are dependent on recreation, are getting more and more involved in this, and you'll see, them getting more and more outspoken. When the first Trump administration shrank Bears Ears National Monument, some people might remember that Patagonia made its entire website black and just put a headline, "The president just stole your land." So these organizations tied to outdoor recreation companies are, or the companies themselves are actually speaking out about public lands. And these are companies that we are often buying clothes or equipment from, and they're becoming an increasingly important player, recognizing that they can have the same kind of influence through their industry that the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, the timber industry can have over how public lands are developed. And so I think it's really important to watch how the outdoor recreation industry continues to get engaged with what's going on with our public lands, because they're in effect also dependent on the resources on our public lands for their businesses.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much for this important discussion. And thanks to all of you for watching today and supporting our journalism at Inside Climate News.